Das Töten in der Ukraine. Das Verbot, die militärische Sonderoperation Krieg zu nennen, all das ist für Nadjezhda kaum zu ertragen. Die Russin will ihre Mitmenschen aufrütteln mit Protestaktionen.
The mining team of the National Guard of Ukraine is working in one of the settlements bordering Russia in the Kharkiv region. Today's mission is to check 110 meters of the field, so that the machinery can come here. The personnel starts working, and their commander with the call sign TNT says that during the occupation the Russians mined entire streets. In any house, under the pillow, a hand grenade can be found, moreover in the open area.
All the indications are that Russian morale is rock bottom, whereas the Ukrainian tails are very firmly up. They've given us a masterclass in operational design, operational maneuver, and operational art. And providing the West continues to provide the support necessary and indeed ramps it up, the Ukrainians, I think, will achieve their military objectives.
10 generals, 1,400 officers and more than 74,000 soldiers. These are the human losses of Russia for 8 months of the war it has unleashed against Ukraine. According to military experts, several hundred Russian soldiers have been killed every day in recent weeks.
Incendiary ammunition, aviation, artillery. Russian troops used almost every type of weapon they have. For 4 months they have been trying to break the defense line of the Ukrainian armed forces near Bakhmut. During this time they have not succeeded. Vitaly Polyakov, a 19-year-old serviceman of the National Guard of Ukraine, cuts off the symbol of Russian troops, the letter Z from a captured armored personnel carrier. He says that this part of the job is the most pleasant, to remove the inscription and repaint the vehicles in the right color.
Еще совсем недавно такое казалось невозможным.
Видите, вон холм, и вот за тем холмом это уже граница с Россией. Мы сейчас едем, возможно, даже за нами наблюдают.
To the war in Ukraine now, where it's claimed Russian forces may have started deploying units threatening to shoot their own retreating soldiers. This according to intelligence from the UK's Ministry of Defence, which suggests these units are described as barrier troops or blocking units, and the report says that such plans would show the low quality, low morale and indiscipline of Russian forces.
Good health to you, fellow Ukrainians. First of all, I want to congratulate you on 2 professional holidays that are celebrated on November 3rd. This is the day of missile troops and artillery, and the day of engineering troops. I sincerely congratulate all warriors, veterans and relatives of our heroes who serve in these troops.
Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky says Russian strikes have left some 4.5 million people without power across the country. Zelensky accuses Moscow of energy terrorism for escalating attacks on Ukraine's power grid as winter looms. Similar attacks on infrastructure have also damaged Ukraine's water supplies. Officials have asked refugees not to return to the country this winter because of fears of further shortages.
The Ukrainian military that wants to be very careful that they're not being lured into some sort of trap, because for the Russians to signal for now, actually a couple of weeks, that they're going to withdraw from Cherson is very unlike them. And so lots of senior and actually troops on the ground smell a rat there.
Officials in Cherson say that Moscow is likely to pull its troops from the west bank of the Dnipro River. Civilians are also urged to leave the region. The move will mean another blow for Russian efforts, but Ukraine is cautious. Western analysts also fear that it could be a trap for the advancing Ukrainian troops.
The Russian army simulates a retreat from the right bank of the Dnipro, and the removal of the Russian flag from the building of the regional state administration in Kherson is yet another provocation. According to the head of the Joint Coordination Press Center of the Defense Forces of the south of Ukraine, the goal is to mislead the Ukrainian command.
to the war in Ukraine, and Western officials say Russian troops could be preparing to withdraw from part of the city of Cherson, which they've held since the start of the war. Ukraine has been talking up an offensive to capture the city since the summer, but progress is slow, and so far they've just retaken some surrounding farmland. Cherson straddles the Dnipro River. Reports suggest Russian commanders may be pulling back troops to the eastern side of the river, which is easier to defend. Our international editor Jeremy Bowen, cameraman Fred Scott and producer Kathy Long have spent the last few days travelling between Mykolaiv and the front lines around Cherson.
I'm afraid it is. Actually, I have no electricity right now. I have no light right now, so I'm right now using my phone to give the interview because obviously there is no Wi-Fi and no electricity. And I'm using like the big lamps which are powered on batteries. But this is probably the smallest of our problems so far because of Russia. And I think that Ukrainians are prepared to have no water and no electricity as long as we have no Russians on our territory killing us.
Does that mean then that for all the talk that Vladimir Putin was merely bluffing, if some senior Russian military leaders did actually get together to discuss potential use of tactical nuclear weapons, there might be substance behind the fears?
Die ukrainische Armee berichtet, dass die Russen an einigen Frontabschnitten ihre Kämpfe verdreifacht haben. Herr Meißner, wie lange müssen wir denn noch dabei zusehen, wie Putin die Ukraine in Grund und Boden bombt?
Das Töten in der Ukraine. Das Verbot, die militärische Sonderoperation Krieg zu nennen, all das ist für Nadjezhda kaum zu ertragen. Die Russin will ihre Mitmenschen aufrütteln mit Protestaktionen. Das ist immer risikoreich, manchmal schmerzhaft. Am 4. Mai habe ich ein Plakat gemalt, Nadel und Garn genommen. Ich hatte das Gefühl, dass der Staat mir sozusagen den Mund zugenäht hatte. Also habe ich mir den Mund zugenäht. Eine Stunde stand sie so da, auf den Straßen von Jekaterinburg. Passanten beschimpften sie, versuchten sie zu schlagen. Schließlich wurde sie von Polizisten abgeführt. Nichts soll die öffentliche Ruhe stören. Nur das Z darf an die Militäroperation erinnern. Jekaterinburg, Millionenstadt im Ural. Sie sei zwar nicht schön, aber lebendig, sagt Iwan. Mit der Politik seines Landes ist er nicht einverstanden, aber er hat sich damit arrangiert, führt ein erfolgreiches IT-Unternehmen. Ich habe nicht vor, auf die Barrikaden zu gehen und mich mit all dem auseinanderzusetzen. Ich mache das, was ich gut kann. Ich habe 60 Leute, für die ich verantwortlich bin. Denen muss ich Arbeit geben. Iwans Hoffnung, dass die Politiker der nächsten Generation bessere Entscheidungen treffen werden. Auswandern wie 100.000 andere will er nicht. Wenn wir weggehen, wer wird dann bleiben? Alkoholiker und diejenigen, die schon zu Zombies gemacht wurden. Zombies, das sind für Iwan die Millionen Russinnen und Russen, die der staatlichen Propaganda glauben. Auch Familienmitglieder von Nadjezhda halten den Angriff auf die Ukraine für unvermeidbar. Meine Cousine sagte, was willst du denn? Was läufst du so rum wie eine Anormale? Muss das denn sein? Auf dich fallen doch keine Bomben. Aber ich bin der Meinung, dass ich Mitschuld trage. Wir hätten früher aktiv werden müssen, uns in das politische Leben unseres Landes einmischen müssen. 4-mal ist Nadjezhda wegen ihrer Proteste schon verhaftet worden. Doch sie will sich den Mund nicht verbieten lassen. Denn härter als die Repressionen trifft sie die Gleichgültigkeit ihrer Mitmenschen gegenüber Tod und Leid in der Ukraine.
Второй столб двойной. 75 метров поля.
Well, Sergei, a double pylon 75-meter field and we go out to the third pylon. That is, our ground is 110 meters away. They need a ground for a dugout. Got it.
A demining team of the National Guard of Ukraine is working in one of the settlements bordering Russia in the Kharkiv region. Today's mission is to check 110 meters of the field, so that the machinery can come here. The personnel starts working, and their commander with the call sign TNT says that during the occupation the Russians mined entire streets. In any house, under the pillow, a hand grenade can be found, moreover in the open area.
Русские используют мины-ловушки, мины-сюрпризы.
The Russians use booby traps, surprise mines, all sorts of tricks in order to complicate the work of the deminers. This is a direct violation of the Geneva Convention. Everything is on an uncontrollable variant, on non-removable, which complicates our work. The work is going on much more slowly. Very strong attention is needed. You have to look under your feet. There may be tripwires, there are minefields. They combine anti-tank with anti-personnel mines such as OZM-72.
Most often in the Kharkiv region, the miners find the Russian anti-tank mine TN62P. It is dangerous because the metal detector does not detect it, since its body is made of plastic. This mine should be disposed of on the spot. To do this, the group acts in a certain algorithm, and after a few minutes, the result.
Come on, fire! Beauty among the running.
The miners say 1 day of active hostilities is equal to a month of demining. On September 12, when the counter-offensive of Ukrainian forces was already underway in the Kharkiv region, the teams of the National Guard of Ukraine began to clear the territory. For example, the village of Prudyanka, before the war, 2,000 people lived here. Now there are only 8. The village was completely destroyed, says local resident Svetlana Shevchenko. Only the walls and the roof are left of the medical clinic.
It was a good clinic. After repair, everything was as it should be. There was a pharmacy here, everything was broken. And here, the registration desk, all the medical cards of people, everything is in place. Nothing has been taken out. I just showed the initiative. Now I will take out at least a few cards.
Next to the clinic there was a market and a village council. Right there the fragments of enemy equipment that needed to be examined for unexploded munition.
As a rule, there may be unexploded munition near such equipment, and our main task is to detect such mines, explosives, and in the future to neutralize them so that it does not harm anyone.
The miners work 24 hours, 7 days a week. They say that they are provided with everything necessary, but there are not enough people. The area of the occupied territories of the Kharkiv region, which needs to be explored, is more than 12,500 square kilometers. Only 100th part has been cleared of mines. Reported by Roman Smoler, Natalia Belokudria, UATV News.
All the indications are that Russian morale is rock bottom. Whereas the Ukrainian tails are very firmly up. They've given us a masterclass in operational design, operational maneuver, and operational art. And providing the West continues to provide the support necessary and indeed ramps it up, the Ukrainians, I think, will achieve their military objectives. Whatever they need to do to beat the Russians with. I think there's any sort of distinction between offensive and defensive weapons is utterly invidious. They should be given all the capabilities required for offensive maneuver, so that's offensive land maneuver, tanks, armored infantry fighting vehicles, the armored engineers, the air defense. They need aircraft as well, of course, as well as the long-range precision missiles and long-range artillery, which has already had a significant effect on the Russians. But they also need the continued support in terms of cyber and intelligence and targeting. Give them the tools to do the job, and they will do the job. Of that, I have no doubt. We have to recognize we need to be ready for war. In a sense, we really are at war already, and we've got to be ready for it. And that means investing in the equipment, the spares, the logistics, the ammunition. That means tooling up industry to churn out the capabilities required. A huge amount of weaponry, anti-tank missiles, artillery ammunition, long-range artillery missiles and the like have been given to Ukraine. Those not only need to be replaced, but we need to have war stocks in our own force as well. And I suspect if you dug into the detail in the Ministry of Defense, we are woefully short. The requirement for the traditional components of offensive maneuver on land, particularly tanks, armored infantry fighting vehicles, artillery, missiles and the like, has not gone away. But it's more complex than that. And we've now seen a drone war, an anti-drone war, the use of autonomous vehicles, the autonomous systems, the requirements to counter those. So all this needs to go into the mix and be looked at objectively in order to build the force that we need to fight 21st century warfare.
Ten generals, 1,400 officers and more than 74,000 soldiers. These are the human losses of Russia for 8 months of the war it has unleashed against Ukraine. According to military experts, several hundred Russian soldiers have been killed every day in recent weeks. Most of them are mobilized.
Most of them are mobilized who rush into battle in the Swatovo direction. They suffer quite large losses in the Bakhmut direction. There are fewer mobilized, but the losses, nevertheless, are quite large. They are trying to advance there. Over the past few days, they have been advancing in the direction of Vuhledar.
The Ukrainian army is inflicting irreparable damage to the Russian army, destroying ammunition depots, headquarters and logistic routes with precision strikes. On the eve, the armed forces of Ukraine destroyed 4 ammunition depots and 6 fuel tanks in the south of Ukraine. The Ukrainian military also struck a concentration of Russian troops in the Chornobaivka area and a crossing in Cherson.
Нашими підрозділами ракетно-артилерійських військ.
During the night, our rocket and artillery units carried out more than 50 fire missions. In particular, they made effective strikes on the alternative crossing in the area of the Antonivsky Bridge, which critically complicated the enemy's logistics. In the area of Chornobaivka, the accumulation of equipment, which the enemy was trying to withdraw to other places of deployment, was hitting the best local traditions. Final results of enemy casualties are being finalized.
President of Ukraine Volodymyr Zelensky also praised the actions of Ukrainian artillerymen and engineering troops.
Today the actions of our soldiers are seen and celebrated by everyone. The world is amazed. The enemy is in panic. Ukraine believes in you, our missile forces and artillery. You are rightly called the gods of war. You make the invaders feel what a strong Ukrainian response is. Our engineering troops, you are the mind and courage of our army. Carrying out tasks in the most difficult conditions every day, you support our troops with dignity and create devastating obstacles for the enemy. We are proud of you. Glory to you. Volodymyr Zelensky, President of Ukraine, on Telegram.
Russian aviation also has huge losses. According to the Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces of Ukraine, Valery Zaluzhny, since the beginning of the full-scale war, Ukraine has destroyed 278 Russian aircraft. This is twice as much as the USSR lost during the 10 years of the war in Afghanistan.
Russian aviation did not take dominance in the air, could not suppress Ukrainian air defense, so now they are forced to operate at a shell of death on the front line. So that's where they lose.
According to Ukrainian intelligence, due to the successful Ukrainian counteroffensive, Russian troops were losing more than 40 units of armored vehicles every day in October. According to British intelligence, Russia has started buying tanks and infantry fighting vehicles from Belarus. Thanks to Western weapons, the armed forces of Ukraine are massively destroying Russian artillery.
We respond to their quantity with the quality and accuracy of artillery fire. This is due to the fact that we received a lot of Western weapons, high-precision projectiles, howitzers, self-propelled artillery mounts, and, of course, the HIMARS missile systems, which have already become a legend of this war.
In total, since the beginning of Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine, the armed forces of Ukraine have destroyed more than 2,700 enemy tanks and 5,550 armored combat vehicles, reported by Serhiy Kulyas, Vlada Surkan, UATV News.
Incendiary ammunition, aviation, artillery. Russian troops used almost every type of weapon they have. For 4 months they have been trying to break the defense line of the Ukrainian armed forces near Bakhmut. During this time they have not succeeded.
For the Russian occupiers, the Bakhmut area, in principle, this district of the Donetsk region, is quite problematic because defense lines were formed there by the armed forces of Ukraine. In fact, since 2014, there has been a stronghold of the armed forces of Ukraine in the Donetsk region. It is more, let's say, monolithically formed more thoroughly than, for example, in the Luhansk region.
The speed of the Russian army's advance around Bakhmut can be measured in meters. For each meter, Russia pays with hundreds of lives of its military. The city of Bakhmut is strategically important for both sides. It is an important junction center, and it can become a base for a further advance. Exactly here, in Bakhmut, a large number of mercenaries of the Wagner Group are involved in the war. Capturing the city is a matter of prestige for Yevgeny Prigozhin. The cook of Putin, one of the richest Russians and owner of the Wagner Group, Prigozhin wants to prove his value as a military leader, and also to humiliate the leadership of the Russian Ministry of Defense, with whom he and Kadyrov are in open conflict. Kremlin propagandists are talking about Prigozhin's successes, but it has no connection to reality.
A Russian information operation is advancing the narrative that Russian forces are making significant progress in Bakhmut, likely to improve morale among Russian forces and possibly to improve the personal standing of Wagner Group financier Yevgeny Prigozhin. Russian forces are likely falsifying claims of advances in the Bakhmut area to portray themselves as making gains in at least one sector amid continuing losses in northeast and southern Ukraine, from the report of the Institute for the Study of War.
Instead, in some areas, the Ukrainian army counterattacked the enemy. During the last assault, it pushed the enemy several kilometers back.
In recent days, the armed forces of Ukraine have made significant progress in Bakhmut. They broke through the line of defense and advanced by 2 to 5 kilometers, gained strategic points which they did not hold before.
Most probably, the Russian military will spend the winter at a disadvantage in the battlefield. They will not be able to take Bakhmut before the frost, says Alexander Kovalenko.
Of course, Bakhmut will not be invaded by the enemy. It is unlikely that the Russians in their current position will be able to occupy it. They need a completely different resource to implement such a task.
Bakhmut remains the hottest place in Donbas. The Russian army is shelling the city every day. There is no electricity, water and gas supply. Local authorities urge civilians who still remain in Bakhmut to evacuate as soon as they can. Reported by Roman Smoler, Vasil Panasyuk, UATV News. Vitaly Polyakov, a 19-year-old serviceman of the National Guard of Ukraine, cuts off the symbol of Russian troops, the letter Z from a captured armored personnel carrier. He says that this part of the job is the most pleasant, to remove the inscription and repaint the vehicles in the right color.
The guys will paint it, they will draw our flag and everything will be beautiful.
Guardsmen remove captured vehicles to a temporary storage facility for damaged vehicles directly from the battlefield. On special trolleys, it is brought to the hangar and proceeds to shipment.
This is a Russian BMP-2 infantry fighting vehicle. Crosses are put right on the battlefield. In this way, we indicate that the vehicle is already ours, and it will be the property of the National Guard of Ukraine of the 3rd Operational Brigade.
Thanks to the so-called Russian Lend-Lease, the National Guard of Ukraine now has its own tanks and infantry fighting vehicles, which they did not have before the invasion. During 8 months of confrontation, hundreds of units of military equipment passed through their hands. For example, this infantry fighting vehicle was recently delivered from Swatovo. It will be put back on wheels and sent to the front line.
This equipment was taken from the servicemen of the aggressor country during the battle. They fled. We had to take it away. We will repair it and will protect our state from illegal attacks.
The Kharkiv collection point also has the very first examples of trophy Russian defense industry, which were seized at the outskirts of the city on February 24th. These are the new KAMAZ and Ural trucks, Colonel Alexander Bohaterov says. They were filled to the top not with military ammunition, but with special equipment for the police, who expected to enter Kharkiv in 3 hours.
Місце дислокації, де вони були затрофейні, це вже було за
The place of deployment where they were captured is behind the Kharkiv bypass. They thought it would be an easy walk to the city of Kharkiv. They would come in and set up their orders on Freedom Square in 2 hours.
Now the Russian Ural truck serves the Ukrainian army and takes both our and captured equipment out of the battlefield.
Such equipment, here we cling to these things, the body springs, and if you want, I'll show you how it lifts.
Now the rainy season has begun, winter is ahead, and it is impossible to carry out offensive operations without tracked vehicles. Therefore, first of all, everything on the tracks is repaired here.
Now you see our repairmen lubricate the bearings of the rollers, then the tracks will be replaced, and then the bearings will be lubricated, disassembled, defected and replaced if necessary.
According to the National Guard, the parade of the Russian abandoned vehicles began during the counterattack by the Ukrainian armed forces in the Kharkiv direction. At that time, Ukrainian forces were replenished with more than 400 units of the so-called Lend-Lease equipment from the Russians. Now Donbas is the main direction where trophy evacuation teams most often go. Reported by Roman Smoler, Natalia Belokudrya, UATV News.
Еще совсем недавно такое казалось невозможным.
Видите, вон холм. И вот за тем холмом это уже граница с Россией. Мы сейчас едем, возможно, даже за нами наблюдают.
Мы движемся вдоль самой границы между Украиной и Россией. Это Харьковская область. Регион, который практически полностью был освобожден во время осеннего контрнаступления вооруженных сил Украины. Но спокойнее здесь не стало.
Это тот случай, когда государственная граница является линией фронта. Обратите внимание, какие здесь происходили бои и что, собственно, осталось от села.
За холмом вже кордон, і вони там. Оттуда і б'ють. Спочатку неприцільно били, а потім приловчилися і в один день цю вулицю. Кожна хата, кожна. Отак як пішли спочатку і отак всю вулицю прочистили.
Местных жителей встретить нам не удалось. Говорят, что после обстрелов они практически все выехали. Отвезти сюда нас согласились бойцы батальона «Дикое поле» из 1-й бригады спецназа. Это именно они организовывали и принимали участие в ключевых штурмах по освобождению Харьковской области. Поэтому им тоже важно оказаться в этом месте, увидеть непосредственный результат их работы. Ведь конкретно здесь Украина уже восстановила свои границы.
Їм обідненько, що ми їх вигнали. Вони нас тільки артою криють, бо бояться сюди зайти. Бо знають, що в ближньому бою у них немає шансів.
Долго здесь находиться пока не рекомендуют.
Ездить здесь нужно очень быстро, потому что места пристреленные. И вот та машина как раз не успела проскочить. Погибли люди.
Тем временем бойцы батальона отправляются на другое направление. Задач очень много. Вот отряд находит склад боеприпасов, который оставили российские войска во время отступления.
В этих ящиках находились боеприпасы к установке «Град». И вот можете обратить внимание на бирку. Заказчик Минобороны РФ. Государственный контракт 2020 год. То есть эти боеприпасы свежие.
В 500 метрах рядом еще один склад. Его российские военные, по словам местных жителей, подорвали. Ближе становится понятно почему.
Это иглы такие.
Флешети.
Наскільки я розумію, вони запрещені.
Чим вони небезпечні? І
ранення дуже важкі. Людина не одразу вмирає. Дуже мучень багато. Наскільки я чув про ці іменно випадки, іменно таких ранень.
Это флешеты, маленькие дротики. Снаряд с ними разрывается в воздухе, и эти иглы разлетаются на громадную площадь, поражая все на своем пути.
А от як воно повинно було бути, якби вони по нам цьому пашили. Отакі стрілочки.
Сейчас главная задача бойцов не дать возможности российским войскам снова захватить территорию.
Мы сдерживаем свои позиции. И мы не дадим им даже зайти сюда. Мы их оттесняем все дальше и дальше, дальше и дальше, даем им понять, что на Украине им делать нечего. Они не знают наших лесов, тут много болот, болотистых мест. И озер много, не знают, не могут, недалеко зайти вовнутрь, там 500-600 метров. Сразу пресекается, потому что все это мы видим.
Их командиры тем временем ждут команду двигаться дальше. Есть громадное желание повторить успех балаклейской наступательной операции. Благодаря ей началась деоккупация региона, детали которой не раскрывают до сих пор.
Противник был в шоке. Дуже був дуже сильний укріпрайон, але путем штурму з підтримкою танків 3-ї танкової бригади ми взяли позицію Москва, пішли на Пітер, взяли Пітер і далі на Новогусаровку. Ми балакаємо про качество і количество, тому качество отримало перемогу.
To the war in Ukraine now, where it's claimed Russian forces may have started deploying units threatening to shoot their own retreating soldiers. This according to intelligence from the UK's Ministry of Defence, which suggests these units are described as barrier troops or blocking units, and the report says that such plans would show the low quality, low morale and indiscipline of Russian forces. Officials in Cherson, meanwhile, say Moscow is likely to pull its troops from the west bank of the Dnipro River. Civilians are being urged to leave the region. Western analysts fear, though, that it could be a trap for advancing Ukrainian troops. The Pentagon says Ukrainian forces can retake Cherson from Russia. Cherson is the only major city that Russia fully captured since its invasion in February. It also includes one side of a dam across the Dnipro River, which controls the water supply for irrigating Crimea. These are images from Kharkiv region, where the Ukrainian army can be seen firing the BM-21 Grad multiple rocket launcher towards Russian positions.
We are moving and pushing the enemy from our territories. That is the direct proof that we have coordination, skills. We have been fighting for 8 years.
Meanwhile, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky says more than 4 million Ukrainians are without power due to Russian attacks on energy infrastructure.
Роз'яснюйте людям, коли і чому. Зараз важливо, щоб зберігалась наша здатність до спільних дій.
It is important now to maintain our ability to act together. So today I want to draw attention to two things. The first is the attention of local authorities. Please ensure that there is no unnecessary use of electricity in all cities and communities of Ukraine. Now is definitely not the time for bright showcases, signboards, advertisements and other such lighting.
Реклам та іншого подібного освітлення.
German Chancellor Olaf Scholz has met with the Chinese President Xi Jinping, becoming the first G7 leader to visit China since the start of the COVID pandemic. Olaf Scholz urged the Chinese president to use Beijing's influence on Moscow to stop the war in Ukraine. Scholz also called on Russian President Vladimir Putin to prolong a deal allowing the passage of grain shipments from Ukraine to avert a hunger crisis. Chinese President Xi Jinping spoke of the need for greater cooperation between China and Germany.
In that respect, it's good that we will have a very intensive exchange on all issues we want to and can discuss in regard to our bilateral relations, the possibilities to further intensify economic cooperation, as well as, of course, the issues where we pursue different perspectives. That's the goal of a good exchange, and I'm delighted that this is a possibility together here today.
The trip comes as voices within Scholz's ruling coalition call for a rethink of Germany's China policy. Beijing has been Berlin's biggest trading partner for the last 6 years. But in a bid to address geopolitical tensions, the current three-party coalition government has announced its intention to reduce its economic dependence and strengthen relations with democratic states in Asia. According to a recent survey, 1 in 2 Germans hope that Germany's economy can be more independent from China.
Бажаю здоров'я, шановні українці.
Good health to you, fellow Ukrainians. First of all, I want to congratulate you on 2 professional holidays that are celebrated on November 3rd. This is the day of missile troops and artillery, and the day of engineering troops. I sincerely congratulate all warriors, veterans and relatives of our heroes who serve in these troops. Ukrainian artillery became the strongest in Europe and one of the strongest in the world. It will always be like that, despite the physical advantage of enemy artillery, simply quantitative. Our warriors provide better results. The advantage of our gunners is qualitative. Skills, intelligence, faith in themselves, in the country. And I signed the decrees on awarding 2 brigades with a special award for courage and bravery. These are the 43rd Separate Artillery Brigade, named after Hetman Taras Tresilo, and the 44th Separate Artillery Brigade, named after Hetman Danilo Apostol. Thank you guys for your precision. Ukrainian engineering troops are exactly those warriors who make a vital contribution to the advancement of our units, and therefore to the liberation of our territory. They create a material basis for the movement of troops and for the protection of positions, barricades, crossings, demining and much more. I thank all units of these 2 branches of the troops, each soldier, relatives of our soldiers, and all those who support them and who help them. On November 3rd, there were various negotiations and meetings to strengthen our state. The visit of the President of Greece took place, and the key meaning of the visit is precisely defensive. We received from Greece the first batch of armored vehicles, which are extremely necessary now. Defense cooperation, strengthening of sanctions against Russia, creation of a special tribunal on the crime of Russian aggression against Ukraine were discussed. Of course, we also talked about the reconstruction of Ukraine. All this is a specific topic for Greece. The community of Ukrainian Greeks traditionally lives in the south of our country, in many cities and villages, a large part of which was badly damaged by Russian strikes. Many Greeks lived in Mariupol, in the Mariupol area. I hope that Greece will actively support our efforts to bring all Russian murderers and torturers to justice for what they have done against our people. And when we return the Ukrainian flag to all the cities and villages of the south of our country, we will certainly invite Greece, its companies and specialists to participate in the restoration of normal life in this part of Ukraine. On November 3rd, I also met with representatives of the US Congress, Senators Chris Coons and Rob Portman. I thanked them for the continued bipartisan support and for the assistance that the United States provides to our country. We talked primarily about an air shield for Ukraine, about how to speed up the liberation of our territory. Challenges in the energy sector were discussed separately and in a very specific manner. Russian attacks on our energy sector, on our energy facilities, do not stop for a single day. Kryvyi Rih was attacked by Iranian drones on the night of November 3rd. Such Russian terror must receive, and surely will eventually receive, a powerful global response. I'm grateful to all our friends in the United States who are helping with this. In general, there is damage to energy facilities in different areas across the country. This is the volume of electricity generation and transportation for millions of people. Only as of evening of November 3rd, about 4.5 million consumers have been temporarily disconnected from consumption under emergency and stabilization schedules. in particular in Kiev and 10 regions: Kyiv region, Dnipropetrovsk region, Zhytomyr region, Zaporizhzhia region, Sumy region, Kirovohrad region, Kharkiv region, Chernihiv region, Khmelnytsky region, Cherkasy region. Blackouts may take place in other regions as well. To endure Russian energy terror and such challenges is our national task, one of the main ones now. The very fact that Russia resorted to terror against the energy industry shows the weakness of the enemy. They cannot defeat Ukraine on the battlefield, and that is why they are trying to break our people in this way, to humiliate Ukrainians, to strike at the morale of our people, at the resistance of our people. I believe that Russia will not succeed. It is important now to preserve our ability to act together. Therefore, I want to draw attention to two things. The first is the attention of local authorities. Please ensure that there is no unnecessary use of electricity in all cities and communities of Ukraine. Now is definitely not the time for bright showcases, signs, advertisements, and other such lighting. I also appeal to the energy companies publicly so that everyone can hear it. Please be more active in explaining to people when and why you disconnect this or that street, this or that district. Now is the time for such micro-communications. People have a right to know, and if consumers contact and report this or that injustice in energy supply, please respond to it immediately. Work together with local authorities. If someone stays without electricity for 8 or 10 hours and everything is connected, including street lighting, across the street, then this is definitely unfair. It is necessary to do everything so that disconnections are predictable and completely understandable for consumers. On November 3rd, I also spoke with the President of Moldova about energy challenges. The terrible consequences of Russian hybrid aggression are felt by all Europeans and the citizens of Moldova as well. We talked with Mrs. Sandu about what we can do together in the interests of our people and for the protection of our states. I also spoke with the President of Indonesia. The topic is clear. This is the G20 summit, which will begin shortly. This is our effort to prevent a food crisis. And I thanked Mr. President for his support in this matter, for his positive assessment of our efforts. There is a conclusion of the International Atomic Energy Agency. It is quite obvious. The organization's mission visited all the objects that Russian representatives mentioned when they told their fantasies about the so-called dirty bomb. We have invited the IAEA to check. We have given them full freedom of actions at the relevant facilities. And we have clear and irrefutable evidence that no one in Ukraine has created or is creating any dirty bombs. And the only thing that is dirty in our region now is the heads of those in Moscow who unfortunately seized control of the Russian state and are terrorizing Ukraine and the whole world. The important document was prepared and published by an international group of experts working under the leadership of Michael McFaul and Andriy Yermak. This is a document about absolutely necessary sanctions against Russia in the IT sphere. This is what can really weaken the potential of Russian aggressiveness. IT is used for missile and drone terror, for the production of military equipment, for cyber attacks and the spread of disinformation. That is, it is one of the pillars of Russian war against Ukraine and freedom in the whole world. We offer a concrete way to break this Russian IT pillar. I am sure that we will complete this task as well. There will definitely be corresponding new sanctions against Russia. And the last point. November 3rd, another 107 Ukrainians were freed from Russian captivity. 6 of them are officers, 101 are sergeants and privates, Army, Navy, Territorial Defense, National Guard, Border Guards. Many of them were wounded, and very seriously. Everyone is already getting the aid they need. I am sincerely glad that another 107 families have seen their loved ones. And I thank all our team who made this exchange possible. Intelligence, the office, the security service, the ombudsman. We will definitely return home all Ukrainian men and women who are in captivity in Russia or in the temporarily occupied territory. We remember each of our heroes. Glory to all who defend our state. Glory to all who fight and work, bringing our victory closer. As for the front, the guys are moving forward. As for the grain, the ships are on their way. As for the occupiers, they are also on their way, following the warships. Glory to Ukraine.
Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky says Russian strikes have left some 4.5 million people without power across the country. Zelensky accuses Moscow of energy terrorism for escalating attacks on Ukraine's power grid as winter looms. Similar attacks on infrastructure have also damaged Ukraine's water supplies. Officials have asked refugees not to return to the country this winter because of fears of further shortages. Joining me from Kyiv is DW correspondent Nick Connolly. Nick, just how challenging is it trying to get the power back up after these airstrikes?
I think it's getting more difficult every time. Simply, it's an issue of spare parts running out. The authorities here say they're now totally dependent on supplies of this equipment coming in from abroad. If there are more rocket attacks from Russia, which we're expecting to be the case. This morning we heard from the mayor of Kyiv that about 500,000 people here or 500,000 households here in the capital are without power. That's on top of the planned outages. People here have a schedule, and about 12 hours in every 24 are going to be without power. It's kind of organised in a way to allow people to kind of go about their daily lives, but it's not fully always accurate, and there is a sense that people are now talking about generators. When you're just on the street, you kind of hear snatched conversation of people for the first time trying to get their heads around what it would be like if it's realistic. Are they going to be able to get diesel to run those generators? Can you put it on your balcony? So it's basically a whole new situation here, and a real sense among people that as winter comes and temperatures are now finally dropping, that this is going to get a lot worse and be a lot less comfortable for people before things really improve.
What about these claims from Moscow that Kyiv was developing a so-called dirty bomb? The International Atomic Energy Agency has found no evidence of that. What was behind the claims?
Well, this looks a lot like just another part of the kind of Russian disinformation strategy. You might remember at the beginning of the war, there was a lot of talk from Moscow about Ukraine having so-called biolaboratories, US money flowing to Ukraine to supposedly produce biological weapons. No evidence on that count was ever provided. I think this is about basically creating a bit of noise, distracting from lots of Russia's defeats on the battlefield for the kind of internal Russian audience, but also internationally. It's about just creating fear in the same way that those kind of constant attacks and fighting around the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant, Europe's biggest, it all just basically creates kind of climate of fear where people maybe who aren't that invested, who aren't following the story here in Ukraine too closely, will just get cold feet, will be worried about the kind of consequences of all this for themselves, even if the real risk isn't necessarily there, and will potentially put pressure on their governments to kind of reduce support for Ukraine. So this is basically just another red herring that's out there, and I think it's not going to be the last. We've seen time and time again lots of kind of often mutually exclusive explanations of things coming out of Moscow, and then a few days later the kind of all talk about these things is then dropped. So there's no real kind of sense that it's really worth logically trying to kind of take these apart. They're just kind of part of war, part of the kind of propaganda war, and as such it's just part of kind of a bigger attempt to get people to kind of be scared about all this and to make people believe that Ukraine doesn't really have a chance of winning this war.
Nick Connolly on the information war and the mass power outages across parts of Ukraine. Thank you very much for bringing us up to date. And let's get more now on the fighting from our Russia analyst, Konstantin Eggert. He joins us from Tallinn. Konstantin, there are signs the Russians are withdrawing from parts of Cherson. Can you tell us why?
Well, I suppose that the Russian commanders, they understand that this battle may well soon be lost. And I suppose that what they want to avoid is this accusations of leaving the quote-unquote Russians, because of course, this operation in the Kremlin parlance was all about liberating Russians in Ukraine, leaving them alone. Depopulation is important for the Kremlin, transfer of population, to use the euphemistic term, because A, it proves to the world, it is supposed to prove, that Russians are really afraid of Ukrainians, that all those people were really liberated and they're running away. Secondly, it replenishes the Russian workforce reservoir. And thirdly, leaves the positions, leaves the area more or less free to fight for whichever Russian forces will remain there. So I think there are three reasons for that.
And where would it place Ukraine strategically if it did recapture the city of Cherson, for example?
It will be a very important win because it's a major city. It's more important than, let's say, the city of Liman that was recaptured earlier. it is to some extent not the only gateway to the Crimea, but is one of the gateways. The Cherson Oblast has one of the most important pumps pumping water, or which is supposed to pump water to the Crimea. Again, not the only one, but because it is probably the biggest city that Ukraine will recapture in the last 2-3 months, it will be also a very visible public relations victory, if you wish. It's going to be very convincing for the Ukrainian public and for the world that the Ukrainian armed forces can really achieve very significant feats. It will also complicate the situation in the Crimea, although it will not completely cut it off from Russia.
And tell us more about what's happening with all of these residents of the eastern and southern provinces who are being relocated.
Well, it seems, and there are lots of reports from independent Russian journalists, from observers, from the NGOs, that these people usually basically either are taken to some kind of holding areas, let's put it like that, or actually because quite a few of them already have Russian passports, especially from the Donetsk and Luhansk Oblast, but Kherson less so. They just disperse in Russia, look for work. What is concerning is the fate of children from the orphanages in Ukraine. They are being reported to be basically transferred to Russia and then being given up for adoption, so they would become essentially Russian citizens or Russians. So I think this is one thing that's been constantly in the media, and which was of concern, of course, is of concern, because this constitutes definitely a very significant human rights violation.
Ripped from Ukraine by their aggressors, Russian aggressors, and then forced to grow up in a Russian family. That is certainly really worrying for those kids. Konstantin Eggert, thank you very much.
Thank you, bye.
The Ukrainian military that wants to be very careful that they're not being lured into some sort of trap, because for the Russians to signal for now, actually a couple of weeks, that they're going to withdraw from Cherson is very unlike them. And so lots of senior and actually troops on the ground smell a rat there.
Russia could be facing a humiliating defeat in the vital southern city of Cherson. Senior commanders are reported to be fleeing to the east over the Dnipro River, leaving the job of holding off the Ukrainian advance to demoralised and poorly equipped conscripts. Well, Cherson was one of the first major cities to fall to the Russian troops breaking out of Crimea in February, and it has been hotly contested since because of its strategic and symbolic importance. Well, the journalist Askold Krushelnitsky is on his way to the area as we speak. He joins me now. Askold, we've spoken many times over the last few months in terms of what's been going on in Ukraine and in your time there. But in terms of the strategic importance of Cherson, it really can't be underestimated, can it?
It is, as you say, very important, and not just because of its military value, but because it is such a big symbol. It's the only regional capital that's ever been captured by the Russians. And following on battlefield humiliations for Putin in the last 6 weeks or so, its fall would be a very hard thing for him to bear. But having said that, the Ukrainians are advancing. They're not advancing rapidly, and there's also a body of thought in the Ukrainian military that wants to be very careful that they're not being lured into some sort of trap, because for the Russians to signal for now, actually a couple of weeks, that they're going to withdraw from Cherson is very unlike them. And so lots of senior and actually troops on the ground smell a rat there.
Well, in terms of the kind of black ops art of misinformation, there's been a lot in this campaign that we've seen and that we've heard about. But we are getting to the point quite soon in parts of the country, we're now into November, where ground that's not taken won't be taken until we get through the winter. Isn't that true?
It won't be taken if there are heavy rains that turn much of the roads and tracks and fields into mud, which is reminiscent of pictures that we see of First World War trenches. That'll make mobility very difficult. But then the winter will kick in and the ground will freeze and vehicles will be able to move again. It very much depends on the weather. Ukrainians are, of course, praying for a mild winter because, as we know, the Russians have knocked out a substantial number, 30% plus of all of Ukraine's electricity generating capacity, because they want Ukrainians to freeze this winter. And Ukrainians are aware of this. They are already planning on alternative sources of heat or going to places where they can share a place that's got, say, a fireplace. But the weather is a very, very big factor. And the colder it is this winter, the better it'll be for Putin.
Okay, Askold, I know you're heading over to Cherson now. Do you have any idea of what you're expecting to see on the way?
I'm not sure how. I'm going to go to Cherson, the region. The Ukrainian military and government have been very, very coy about letting journalists go to the front lines there because they don't want any information to be seen by the Russians. They don't want especially TV and photographers there. So what I'm expecting to see is a lot of transportation happening, both military vehicles, weapons, military supplies, food, a lot of movement on the roads. And what happens and how soon it happens, if there is an imminent attack on Cherson by the Ukrainians, should become clearer in the coming days.
Now, Russia is making another strategic retreat. Officials in Cherson say that Moscow is likely to pull its troops from the west bank of the Dnipro River. Civilians are also urged to leave the region. The move will mean another blow for Russian efforts, but Ukraine is cautious. Western analysts also fear that it could be a trap for the advancing Ukrainian troops. The Pentagon says that Ukrainian forces can retake Kherson from the Russian troops. Moscow, however, is silent on the developments in Kherson. Now remember, Kherson is the only major city that Russia has fully captured since its invasion in February. It also includes one side of a dam across the Dnipro River, which controls the water supply to irrigate Crimea, the peninsula that Russia has occupied since 2014. Now, previously, Russia had denied its forces were planning to withdraw from the area. In September, Moscow declared it had annexed Ukraine's Kherson, Donetsk, Luhansk, and Zaporizhia regions after staging so-called referendums. The move was rejected as bogus and illegal by Kiev and the West. Now, elsewhere too, raging battles continue in Ukraine. These are images from Kharkiv region, where Ukrainian army can be seen firing the BM-21 Grad multiple rocket launchers towards Russian positions.
В результатах, якби не було, в результаті продвигаємося, витісняємо ворога з наших територій. Це вже є прямий доказ, що у нас і зложення, і злагодження є, і на навики вже 8 років воюємо, як не.
Now, there is also no let-up in Russian firepower. Over the past 24 hours, Russian forces have launched 3 missiles and 16 airstrikes on Ukrainian targets, as well as massive shelling from its artillery units. On the southern front, Russian fire hit more than 35 towns. Kiev says Ukrainian aircraft launched 12 strikes on 8 Russian-occupied areas. However, these are claims from both warring sides, and WION is not able to verify the battlefield reports. Russian attacks in the past few weeks on Ukrainian energy and water supplies have hit civilians hard. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky says 4.5 million Ukrainians in the capital Kiev and 10 other regions are temporarily without power. In just the last month, a third of the country's power stations have reportedly been destroyed. Now, for more on this, we're being joined by Russland Bortnik, a political analyst from Kiev. Thank you for being with us. Now, how do you see the reports of the Russian retreat from Cherson?
Hello, colleagues. It's not easy to answer your question because from our side, it seems like the armed forces of Russian Federation and armed forces of Ukraine are playing a complex military political game around the city of Cherson, and both sides are trying to provoke each other into an exhausting offensive operation in order to prepare the counteroffensive attacks. Such kind of demonstrative public evacuation which Russia provides and continue in the occupied part of Cherson region, and Russia is state bodies in the region, archives, even flags somewhere, but it's very shown operation. It's an operation which should show for Ukrainian forces that Russia is going out from Cherson, but at the same time we have no any evidence. The evidence is that the Russian army is going out from Cherson. Only civilian person or only civilian state bodies. In general, in the future development of the situation of the city in Cherson remains not clear. Ukrainian officials say that they cannot further develop the counteroffensive operation on this field due to the depletion of Western weapons and resources also. It is possible that in this way, Ukraine and the Russian Federation are trying to misinform each other. Intelligence and the Office of President of Ukraine believe that the Russian armed forces are not going to leave Cherson and the city and region at all.
Right. On that, how valid are these concerns of Kiev's that there could be a trap to lure in the advancing Ukrainian troops in Cherson?
Of course, I cannot say anything with absolute certainty in this situation. I will only express only my opinion of my colleagues on our think tank. The Ukrainian leadership considers the Russian statements on Cherson as a trap and as an attempt to lure Ukrainian troops into an ill-conceived offensive that could end in defeat of Ukrainian soldiers and Ukrainian army in this field. And the failure of Ukrainian defensive possible failure near Cherson can again open the gates for Russian forces to the city of Nikolaev and Odessa. So we have no enough evidences, but we see the real political military game which one side and another side try to misinform each other, and both sides wanted to be in defense for nowadays and don't want to make any offensive operation.
How critical are the damages to the Ukrainian energy infrastructure as Russia continues to target them?
Russian missile strikes on Ukraine have already cost $1 billion for Ukrainian economy, of course, and damage about 40% of Ukrainian entire energy infrastructure. Power plants, thermal plants, hydroelectric plants, and the most important electricity distribution system to consumers. And Russian missiles and drone attacks continue, and the situation is getting worse day by day, to be honest. As today, for about 20% of Ukrainian population are without electricity, and more than half of population of Ukraine with the shortage of electricity. We have a big problem, and as I know, the Ministry of Energy of Ukraine yesterday, in the meeting with the presidential faction of Servant of People, said that Ukrainians should be prepared for the weeks without electricity. Situation is getting worse and worse.
Ruslan, thank you very much for bringing us all the latest out of Kyiv.
Thank you, colleagues.
We are now available in your country. Download the app now. Get all the news on the move.
The Russian army simulates a retreat from the right bank of the Dnipro, and the removal of the Russian flag from the building of the regional state administration in Cherson is yet another provocation. According to the head of the Joint Coordination Press Center of the Defense Forces of the South of Ukraine, the goal is to mislead the Ukrainian command.
These are certain provocations in order to create the impression that these settlements have been abandoned, that it is safe to enter them, but given that they were preparing for street fighting, how they position their units, were aware of the planned tactics of action, do not rush to rejoice. You need to understand that a hybrid war also involves such information stuffing and attacks. Natalia Humenyuk, head of the Joint Coordination Press Center of the Defense Forces of the South of Ukraine, on the air of the national telethon.
The Russian military remains in the city. Some dress up as civilians and move into the homes of people who have left, the press center of the Defense Forces of the South of Ukraine informs.
The Russians are allegedly retreating, taking out the occupation authorities from the right to the left bank of the Dnipro River. But in fact, 32,000 Russian invaders, now concentrated on the right bank of the Dnipro, are a heavy-duty combat unit which is able to resist and carry out certain counteractions.
Earlier, the occupation authorities called on local residents to evacuate to the left bank of the Dnipro River. They intimated people with the offensive of the armed forces of Ukraine. Now the evacuation has become compulsory. People are taken to the occupied Crimea and Russia. The Russian occupiers declare that all residents must leave the occupied Kakhovka by November 7th. Cars with loudspeakers drive around the city and warn of evacuation.
Forced eviction and deportation of people from the left bank of the Dnipro River is the second stage, because the first took place in the city of Cherson and on the right bank. The construction of trenches and dugouts, as well as pulling out equipment, everything that is happening now along the entire bank suggests that the invaders will be located and move the front line just along the Dnipro River.
The Russian army will not leave Kherson, experts are sure. The city is extremely important to Putin.
This is the factor of the Dnipro water, which is supplied to the temporarily occupied Crimea, and the factor of the land corridor. In fact, after February 24th of this year, this is the only regional center that the Russian occupying army was able to occupy. Therefore, it is clear that the loss of the regional center will entail certain internal political risks and changes in the Russian Federation. Does Putin need it now? No.
However, experts rule out the possibility of blowing up the Kakhovka hydroelectric power plant mined by the Russian military in the near future. After all, then Russia can forget about the water supply to the occupied Crimea. Despite Putin's attempts to intimidate the Ukrainian government by blowing up the Kakhovka HPP or a nuclear strike, the Ukrainian army will continue its counteroffensive.
In November, the time will come when the Russian occupiers will still be forced to leave the right bank side and the city of Kherson itself, under the onslaught of Ukrainian armed forces.
In the meantime, the armed forces of Ukraine are carrying out precise strikes on the positions of the Russian army in the Kherson direction.
During the night, our rocket and artillery units carried out more than 50 fire missions. In particular, they made effective strikes on an alternative crossing in the area of the Antonivsky Bridge, which critically complicated the enemy's logistics. In the area of Chornobayevka, the accumulation of equipment, which the enemy was trying to withdraw to other places of deployment, was hit in the best local traditions.
Earlier, the head of the main intelligence directorate of the Ministry of Defense of Ukraine, Kyrylo Budanov, said that the armed forces of Ukraine intend to deoccupy Cherson this month. According to him, the liberation of the city from the Russian invaders will inflict a crushing blow on the Kremlin. Reported by Sergei Kulas, Yulia Hranovska, UATV News.
To the war in Ukraine, and Western officials say Russian troops could be preparing to withdraw from part of the city of Cherson, which they've held since the start of the war. Ukraine has been talking up an offensive to capture the city since the summer, but progress is slow, and so far they've just retaken some surrounding farmland. Cherson straddles the Dnipro River. Reports suggest Russian commanders may be pulling back troops to the eastern side of the river, which is easier to defend. Our international editor Jeremy Bowen, cameraman Fred Scott and producer Kathy Long have spent the last few days travelling between Mykolaiv and the front lines around Cherson.
In the trenches a mile or so from the Russian perimeter around Cherson, soldiers from the Ukrainian 63rd Brigade have learnt to be cautious. They're digging in for a long winter. I love my dugout, he says. It's going to be warm. This is the ground where months of optimistic talk from Ukraine's leaders of the Cherson offensive has collided with the stark reality of pushing Russia back.
Moving forward, and a counter-offensive is complicated to plan for, and it's a threat to people's lives. We have to take count of everything. That's our job as commanders, to keep our men alive.
Outside Mykolaiv, the city facing occupied Cherson, they don't believe the Russians will fold. Piles of used-up tank shells show how hard it's been. On the Mykolaiv front, the soldiers say they don't have the combat power to match Russia's numbers or heavy guns.
They've got more military equipment, more people. Their soldiers are not trained, but they just charge forward, shouting hurrah. We don't have as many bullets as they have people.
You can see why the Cherson offensive is taking a lot of time. It's flat, open ground. They're under the Russian guns. And this is what happens to them every day. That's why, since the summer, they've been talking about it, and it's hard to move forward. The ruins of Mykolaiv's regional governor's office, destroyed early in the war, are a constant reminder of what Russia can do. Here as well, no one believes Russia's defeat is inevitable. General Dmytro Marchenko, the commander credited with stopping the Russian advance, now coordinates plans to recapture Cherson.
First of all, we need reactive artillery that can hit up to 300 kilometers from us, and we need an air defense system, basics for any army in the world that wants to go on the offensive.
An enemy who can do this, the general believes, cannot be beaten without overwhelming force, which Ukraine wants but does not have. Clean water is trucked into Mykolaiv because Russia blew up the waterworks. In the queue, someone said they can't bring us to our knees. Defiance doesn't stop fear or anguish. It's painful, says Oksana. Everyone here is crying inside. They're worried too about doing this in winter and the freeze. Close by this week, Russian missiles have hit civilian houses. One of the residents here was killed. People with very little have lost everything. not much was left to salvage in this house. Lyubov has 2 sons in the army. The Russians were saying hello, she said. Then everything fell on my head.
What is so difficult for people is the unpredictability of a strike that comes in the middle of the night when they think they're relatively safe at home.
Her neighbor, a firefighter used to rescuing others, was rescuing himself.
We can't stop fighting. We are on guard for our country. No one but us will protect it. I've faced this so many times. Now it has come to my house. The main thing is that we are alive. Everything else, we can start again.
The pity of war envelops Mykolaiv, the price of local victories that keep the pressure on the Russians. If it comes to a battle for Cherson, the price and the pity rise sharply. Jeremy Bowen, BBC News, Mykolaiv.
And our special guest tonight is Ukrainian MP Alona Shkrum. Good evening.
Good evening.
Last time we tried to reach you, there was no electricity in Kyiv. So is the city still suffering from power outages, or is the situation looking better today?
I'm afraid it is. Actually, I have no electricity right now. I have no light right now. So I'm right now using my phone to give the interview, because obviously there is no Wi-Fi and no electricity. And I'm using like the big lamps which are powered on batteries. But this is probably the smallest of our problems so far because of Russia. And I think that Ukrainians are prepared to have no water and no electricity as long as we have no Russians on our territory killing us.
Hopefully. Now let me ask you about today's meeting in Ankara. NATO Secretary General is about to meet the Turkish President Erdogan. Now, in your opinion, what should Ukraine expect from this meeting? Because as we hear from some media, Turkey is not that, is rather reluctant in supplying Ukraine with more weaponry, apart, of course, from the famous Beitrag drones.
The problem is that Turkey has been one of the possible negotiators between the rest of the world and Russia on the grain deal. And I think that you know that because of Russian blockage, 1 billion of people could be starving and could be suffering from no food in Africa, in the Middle East, in Latin America, all over the world, because of Russia acting as a terrorist state. So what we expect from Turkey is actually, well, first to reinstate the grain deal. And I think that it will be reinstated. I think that Russia has completely no possibilities to do otherwise. And second, to actually understand that unfortunately no guarantees that Putin is giving and that Russia is giving are proper guarantees, because Russia guaranteed that the grain deal would be in place and didn't do anything about it and broke it up. Russia guaranteed that they would respect the sovereignty of Ukraine.
Let me interrupt you here. Isn't it that the grain deal is back on? Because today 7 ships with grain sailed up from Ukrainian ports.
Well, I am an optimist, I have to say, no matter what, but I don't think it's really back, because Russia is always playing the game. So we hope that it would be reinstated yesterday. Then they let the several ships out, and then they continue to act as a terrorist state. So they can let 6 ships or 10 ships, and then say that to let other ships, we actually need further negotiations and discussions. And this is what they're doing all the time. So I don't think that we actually believe.
Yes, we're back.
Yeah. So very shortly, I do not think that we can believe that it has been fully reinstated, because we don't believe Russia anymore, and neither should the world, and neither should Turkey. Russia is acting as a terrorist, and the terrorist always terrorizes and always lies. But of course, we will do everything together with Turkey and Western partners and you guys, what is in our power to provide food to the world. Yes.
Right. There will be no inquiry into the alleged production of some biological warfare in Ukraine, which Russia was calling for. How did you react on this UN Security Council decision?
I can tell you my personal opinion because I've been working on that for a while. I think that Russia should be out of the UN Security Council. And this is pretty much all I've been focusing on, and a lot of Ukrainian lawyers and international lawyers have been doing that. Russia was never supposed to be a member of the UN Security Council. Russia actually was the only country in the world, and this is very important, that did not get to be member of the UN with the vote. So every other country in the world was voted by the General Assembly to become a member of the UN. Russia just took a place of the Soviet Union in the Security Council, and the veto from the Soviet Union, which it should never get. And now that Russia broke every rule in the UN statute, I think that Russia should be completely out of the UN Security Council, and UN Security Council should be really changed and reformed, and this is the place to do that. And actually, a lot of international lawyers agree with us, and more than 190,000 Ukrainians have signed the petition to get that done and agree with us. So I think that we should do that, and also I would ask, a lot of help from the Western countries to do that, and then we could trust the UN again, and the UN can work normally again.
I guess the vast majority of the international community would agree with you. Now, leader of the Belarusian opposition in exile, Svetlana Tsikhanouskaya, stated that if any missile is launched from the territory of Belarus and reaches Ukraine, Ukraine has every right to strike back. Now, do you see it as a real threat, the possibility of an open war with Belarus?
So it's a hard question for me personally and for me as a lawyer, because as a lawyer, I can tell you that Belarus, Lukashenko, has already committed a lot of international crimes by allowing Russian troops to go through its territory to Ukraine, right, and almost to occupy Kiev, and by allowing every day to hit missiles from Belarus and to hit Kiev and other cities. But I know that we do not hit territories of other countries. We will not hit Belarus. We are not doing that. We are just protecting our own territory, and for the time being, it is what it's going to be. We are in a defensive position. We will recuperate our territory and save our people, but we will not hit any other, any other territories, even if we know that their leaders are committing criminal acts and acts of aggression also. They would be judged later, and I think they will all be part of the prosecution on the tribunal against the war of aggression which Putin is committing.
Right, and about courts and atrocities which are taking place in Ukraine, how do you react to the news of graves of nearly 900 civilians uncovered lately in the liberated territories in the east and south of Ukraine?
It is, it's every time we receive those news, we think that we are used to that, but really you cannot get used to that. And when you hear stories and when you feel, and when you see people writing to you and people who are relatives or who escaped or who had relatives there, it's completely terrifying. And still, I do not believe that this is going on in the center of Europe in our time in the 22nd century. So the only thing that still keeps me up and keeps me going is the complete belief and factual belief that we will win this war, that this is a war against a completely terrorist state. It should be recognized as a terrorist state, as it has been by already some of the legal proceedings, and all of the people who are doing that should be punished. Putin will be setting on the tribunal against the war crimes, and as it has been with other dictators from Yugoslavia and other parts of the world. And I think that we will see it, and my generation will see that, and then we will have a completely different world, which would be a world with architecture of security that actually works. And this is the only thing that we keep in our mind when we discover every such of those news.
And then again, many dictators escaped justice in the past. But President Zelensky...
I don't think that one will. I don't think he will. I think he's gone too far.
I agree with you. He's gone too far. President Zelensky stated that he'd love to go to the seaside. He was definitely talking about the southern parts of Ukraine, also including Crimea, but not this winter, maybe next summer. Now, do you share this optimism that Crimea can be actually liberated by next summer?
I'm not a military expert, so I don't know what our military possibilities are, because you have to understand that while the morale of people is so high that they are staying without electricity, without water, without heat in their cities and protecting their land and going to fight for our land. So the morale is very high, but still I know that we lose a lot of people when we are liberating the territory. So defending is much easier in terms of sacrifices we are making and best people, best soldiers who we're losing than liberating the territory. So it will only depend on our military situation and on the amount of weapons and actually defense air systems that we will get from our partners. And we still ask a lot of partners to get us more. For example, France has promised more air defense systems, so each air defense system actually saves a lot of lives, right? And it will depend on that. But we do have this saying next year in Yalta. Yalta is a big city in Crimea, which has become super symbolic, and this phrase is used in Ukraine a lot and has been used for a while. Crimean Tatars, who are natives to Crimea, often said that after being illegally deported from the Soviet Union from Crimea and then illegally deported from Russia from Crimea when Russia occupied it. So we do say next year in Yalta. It might not be in summer, it might be in autumn, but we really hope that next year we'll see each other in Yalta, and obviously it would be, a hugely emotional thing.
We also remember Yalta from the Polish history with some rather bad connotations, but I guess it's better in Ukraine. Ukraine MP Alona Shkrum was our guest this evening. Thank you very much, and I wish you all the best.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you. And thank you for watching. That's all for now, and stay with us for more here on TVP World.
Does that mean then that for all the talk that Vladimir Putin was merely bluffing, if some senior Russian military leaders did actually get together to discuss potential use of tactical nuclear weapons, there might be substance behind the fears?
Well, I think we always have to assume that there could very well be substance behind what Putin is saying about nuclear weapons. But I think what they were talking about is a couple of weeks ago, U.S. military leaders called the Russians and talked to them about this saber rattling. So it wasn't necessarily Russian generals getting together, having a meeting, pulling in the U.S. I think this is a conversation that might have even been started by the U.S., trying to warn off the Russian military, saying, don't even think about using a tactical nuclear weapon, that this would be just more heartache and more cost to Russia without any benefit on the battlefield. So I think this was a discussion between the U.S. and the Russian military authorities about nuclear weapons, and particularly the U.S. message, don't do it.
From your experience in this area, Jim, do you have any sense of how that conversation might have gone and how the Russians might have responded to those kinds of threats, behind the scenes?
Well, I think the Russian military, they're under a lot of pressure right now. They haven't performed very well on the battlefield, as you know. This has been problem for the Russian generals, for the officers around Putin. So they're not about to say something to American generals that is something outside the party line from Putin. I'm sure there are a lot of ears listening in on those telephone conversations in Moscow. I'm sure that if there was anything said between the militaries that were off script for Moscow, that general might have been pushed out of an open window. So I think that I think it was probably a very sobering discussion. I think it's something where the U.S. military had a message to deliver, which, as I said, was there's no value in this. Of course, it's Putin's call, but I think for the U.S. military is making sure that the Russian military counterparts understood that the U.S. and the West were going to respond to something to make it very painful. So I'm sure it was a sobering discussion. It was one of plain talk, very frank talk between the militaries, and I think messages were sent back and forth.
Yeah, and talking of frank, Jim, I'm just looking back at quotes from last month, and I think on October the 6th or 7th, President Biden warned that the world could face, quotes, Armageddon if Vladimir Putin used a tactical nuclear weapon to try and win that war in Ukraine. And then last week, you'll remember, I'm going to quote Vladimir Putin, he said, "I'm convinced that sooner or later, both the new centers of a multipolar world order and the West will have to start an equal conversation about a common future for us, and the sooner the better, of course." And he added that he thought the West was losing its dominance and quickly becoming a minority on the world stage. A shift, in a way, from Vladimir Putin.
Well, I think, the speech you're referring to, there's been abuse that this was actually helped to lower tension.
Yeah.
That Putin himself kind of didn't rattle that nuclear saber the way he had done in the past. And the Armageddon point that
President
Biden made, that has been, I think, has lost its umph, if you will.
Yeah.
It's lost some of its juice over time. So I think right now, because the conversations that we're talking about here between the Russian and the American generals, that was in October. The Putin speech that you just referenced was in October, and also the Biden remark. And I think we're at a place now where the saber rattling is not as loud as it might have been back then. Remember, too, NATO had a nuclear exercise. The Russians had a nuclear exercise as well. But things have gotten kind of quiet. And I think, remember also, frankly, last October, also to talk about Ukraine and a dirty bomb, which was just totally ridiculous. So I'm hoping that what we're going to see in this new month of November is not going to have that kind of noise. If what Putin said in his speech, we've got our midterms getting ready to happen here. So Biden and everyone, we're all focused on the midterm elections just around the corner. So let's hope that November, in terms of nuclear saber rattling, is going to be a little quieter.
Mm-hmm. Meanwhile, the Ukrainians might be concerned that the Western capitals, the Western allies, are getting tired, getting fatigued, and that's what Vladimir Putin is counting on, isn't it?
That's exactly right. What Putin is counting on is not just that fatigue, but also that they become frightened, whether it's in the U.S. or it's in the West, in Europe, that they become frightened by this nuclear talk. So I think you're absolutely right about Putin in terms of hoping that things will happen politically in the United States or within Europe during the cold winter, fractures appear, or there's fear generated by this idea of nuclear escalation. That Putin's hope is that will lead to a reduction in support to the Ukraine military.
Well, we'll have to see, Jim. Thank you very much indeed. That's Jim Townsend, former Deputy Secretary of Defence for Europe and NATO under Obama-Biden administrations.
Die ukrainische Armee berichtet, dass die Russen an einigen Frontabschnitten ihre Kämpfe verdreifacht haben. Herr Meißner, wie lange müssen wir denn noch dabei zusehen, wie Putin die Ukraine in Grund und Boden bombt?
Das kann man natürlich heute schlecht sagen. Die ukrainische Militärführung geht selbst davon aus, dass der Krieg bis weit ins nächste Jahr dauert. Die Russen haben ihre Menschenmängel und Menschenverluste teilweise ausgeglichen. Sie haben das durch eine Mobilisierung geleistet, aber unter ganz großen Aufwendungen bis hin zu regelrechten Soldatenprotesten, Soldatengruppen, die ihnen versprochene Zahlungen verlangten und in den Streik regelrecht getreten sind. Wir wissen also zwei Dinge nicht. Wir wissen nicht, wie erfolgreich Russland weiterhin Menschen mobilisieren kann. Und wir wissen auch nicht ganz genau, wie leicht sich die Menschen mobilisieren lassen. Dort ist im Moment sehr viel an Unruhe und sehr viel an Durcheinander zu beobachten.
Mitte November findet ja auf Bali der G20-Gipfel statt. Präsident Zelensky, der ist auch dazu eingeladen worden, hat jetzt aber gesagt, er nimmt nur teil, wenn Putin nicht kommt. Ist das Ihrer Meinung nach ein Zeichen dafür, dass man von Verhandlungen momentan noch ganz weit entfernt ist?
Wahrscheinlich ja. Denn auch die Frage, ob man Putin teilnehmen lassen solle, hat in den letzten Wochen und Monaten ja eine gewisse Rolle gespielt, auch innerhalb der Debatten der westlichen Politiker. De facto ist es so, dass Russland immer noch hofft, seine Forderungen durchzusetzen. In Russland die Propaganda verbreitet wird, man erwarte, dass der Westen sich gezwungen sehe, mit Russland zu verhandeln. Man sieht sich also in einer Auseinandersetzung mit dem ganzen Westen. Und umgekehrt ist natürlich die Ukraine jetzt genötigt oder sieht sich genötigt, auch ihre Position möglichst stark zu artikulieren, damit nicht auf Kosten ihrer eine Einigung der Großen stattfindet. Das ist nämlich das, worauf Putin möglicherweise setzt.
Worin könnte denn Ihrer Meinung nach ein Ansatz für Verhandlungen liegen?
Nun, der müsste natürlich irgendwo das internationale Recht berücksichtigen. Und das sind in den letzten 8 Jahren ja mindestens 2 große Rechtsbrüche geschehen. Die Attacke auf die Krim und die Besetzung des Donbas und natürlich der Angriff in diesem Jahr. Und vor dem Hintergrund des Völkerrechts müsste man beide Entwicklungen rückgängig machen. Und dafür scheint Russland momentan noch nicht bereit zu sein. Ob die Ukraine bereit ist, sich auf dem mittleren Weg, etwa auf der Lage der Grenzen Ende Februar 2022, mit Russland zu einigen, das wissen wir nicht. Ich hoffe, dass man sich mit der Zeit Überlegungen anstellt, die vielleicht auch in diese Richtung gehen könnten. Aber das wäre natürlich vor dem Hintergrund des Völkerrechts eine allenfalls Teillösung. Also ich sehe im Moment tatsächlich keine wirkliche Lösung und vor allem sehe ich keine Bereitschaft, was immer eine Lösung wäre, dann auch auf beiden Seiten zu akzeptieren. Und daher glaube ich nicht, dass wir vor sehr erfolgreichen Verhandlungen in der nächsten Zukunft stehen.
Besonders entscheidend für Präsident Putin ist ja auch, wie viel Rückhalt er in seiner eigenen Bevölkerung hat, aber auch natürlich beim eigenen Militär. Wie stark ist Putin denn momentan noch?
Ja, das ist wahrscheinlich die Gretchenfrage. Wir reden sehr häufig von der russischen Zivilgesellschaft und müssen uns aber eingestehen, dass es eine Zivilgesellschaft so wie bei uns in Russland nicht gibt. Die Gesellschaft ist gar nicht in der Lage, sich so zu organisieren, wie wir das dürfen, von Vereinen bis zu größeren über individuellen Institutionen hinweg ist die Gesellschaft in Russland unter ganz großem Druck. Sie zerfällt in viele lokale Teilgesellschaften. Die Leute arbeiten ganz anders. Körperliche Kraft und Gewalt spielen im Alltag und in der Wirtschaft noch eine viel größere Rolle als bei uns. Und dementsprechend auch Gewaltunternehmer, so wie der Politiker und Gewaltunternehmer Ramsan Kadyrov oder Prigoschin, der Leiter einer Militärunternehmergruppe. Die haben auch eigene Propagandakanäle und artikulieren da auch ihre eigenen Interessen. Gewalt und Gewaltunternehmertum organisiert in Russland ganz heterogene Interessen. Und tatsächlich gibt es Konflikte zwischen dem Militär, dessen Führung durch Putin in der letzten Zeit mehrfach immer wieder auf allen Ebenen ausgewechselt wurde, diesen Gewaltunternehmern in der Bürokratie selbst. Also tatsächlich ist es so, dass man nicht von einem einheitlichen Rückhalt Putins sprechen kann, sondern es gibt einen Rückhalt Putins bei seiner unmittelbaren politischen Umgebung. Es gibt keine großen Proteste in der großen Mehrheit der Gesellschaft, vor allem auf dem Land. Es gab Proteste in den Städten, die blutig und brutal unterdrückt worden sind und zu Fluchtbewegungen geführt haben. Und es gibt die Eigeninteressen der wirtschaftlich Handelnden und vor allem auch der Gewaltunternehmer. Das ist ein ganz großes Durcheinander.
Wir haben ja vor einigen Wochen, als die Ukrainer im Norden angegriffen haben, gesehen, dass sich die Russen auch zurückgezogen haben, dass die Kampfesmoral unter den Soldaten nicht mehr allzu groß war. Ist das Ihrer Meinung nach etwas, was Putin auch gefährlich werden kann? Oder ist das irgendwo auch Wunschdenken des Westens, dass seine Macht auch beim Militär und bei den Soldaten bröckelt?
Ja, vielleicht ist es da vor allem die innere Kohärenz der Armee, die gefährdet ist. Wir hören sogar von erheblichen Konflikten. Es hat sogar gewalttätige Auseinandersetzungen zwischen Rekruten in der Umgebung von Belgorod gegeben. Alkoholmissbrauch und natürlich Unterdrückung und Gewalt innerhalb der Armee sind ein perennierendes Problem in der russischen Armee. Und inzwischen sehen wir, dass die Ukraine erfolgreich auch relativ regelmäßig auf das Ostufer des Dnepr hin wirken. Und zwar nicht nur mit weitreichender, sondern auch mit kürzer reichender Artillerie. Das heißt, man arbeitet sich an Cherson heran, genauso wie man sich im Osten schrittweise an Kremina und Lysychansk heranarbeitet. Das heißt, während die Ukraine eine relativ kohärente und planmäßig arbeitende Truppe darstellt, scheint auf der russischen Seite vieles regelrecht in Unordnung gekommen zu sein. Und das betrifft nicht nur die logistischen Schwierigkeiten.
Bundeskanzler Olaf Scholz ist ja jetzt nach China gereist, spricht dort mit dem chinesischen Staatschef. Also es geht da ja unter anderem auch um die Beziehungen Chinas zu Russland, aber natürlich auch um den Krieg in der Ukraine. Liegt denn auch irgendwo der Schlüssel für diesen Krieg vielleicht in China?
Also der Schlüssel wahrscheinlich nicht, möglicherweise ein Schlüssel. China ist momentan durch die Corona-Epidemie und vor allem durch die chinesische Form, sich mit ihr auseinanderzusetzen, erheblich geschwächt. Wirtschaftlich, was seine Politik angeht und die Autorität der politischen Führung, das ist ja ganz deutlich. China hat in den letzten Monaten symbolisch, das heißt in internationalen Verlautbarungen und auf der internationalen Bühne, Russland relativ intensiv unterstützt, materiell und militärisch aber eigentlich kaum. Das heißt, China laviert sich ein bisschen durch im Moment. Und das ist wahrscheinlich auch das, was man von so einer Macht im Moment erwarten muss. Es wäre natürlich schön für alle Beteiligten, wenn China die Rolle eines Vermittlers übernehmen könnte. Aber das scheint es im Moment nicht zu können. Und dafür spielt sicher eine Rolle auch seine eigene wirtschaftliche Verfassung im Moment. Und wahrscheinlich ist es deswegen auch gar nicht so klug zu erwarten, dass man nun auf wirtschaftlichem Gebiet von China sehr viel an Unterstützung und an Response seitens Deutschlands erwarten kann. Vielmehr sollte man unter den Bedingungen, die wir gerade haben, ganz massiv das Prinzip der Gleichrangigkeit, der Reziprozität und der Gleichberechtigung China gegenüber artikulieren, deutlicher als das in der Vergangenheit der Fall war. Vielleicht wird man auf diese Art und Weise China dazu bringen, eine eben unter Umständen auch vermittelndere und konstruktivere Rolle im Konzert der großen Mächte zu spielen.
Ganz herzlichen Dank, Herr Meißner, für das Gespräch. Dankeschön.